A traffic stop that should have lasted 5 minutes. Or maybe it was a setup from the start. When two corrupt cops think they can intimidate and humiliate a black woman, they have no idea who they're dealing with. Because she's not just any woman, she's a mother, a former Delta Force operative, and the one person who can bring their entire system crashing down. Just minutes later, those same officers open fire and shoot her 17-year-old daughter dead right in front of her eyes. What follows is a relentless journey through betrayal cover-ups and one mother's unstoppable fight for justice. And trust me, you won't be able to look away once this begins. Let us know what time you're watching and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your voice. The sun filtered through the gauzy curtains of a quiet, modest home nestled beneath moss-draped oaks just outside Savannah, Georgia. The kitchen clock ticked softly, a subtle metronome to the rhythm of morning, while the scent of brewed coffee mingled with the warmth of cinnamon and toasting bread. Captain Alexandria Cole stood barefoot at the stove, her robe loosely tied around her waist, her movements calm, practiced unhurried, like someone who had learned to savor peace only after seeing too much of its absence. She flipped a slice of French toast with the kind of precision that once guided battlefield strategy but now served only her daughter's breakfast. Her eyes flicked toward the hallway, alert to the sound of footfalls she could recognize in a heartbeat, because when you've lost too much, you learn to memorize what you still have left. From the second floor, the familiar creak of hardwood signaled her daughter Naomi was awake, and within seconds Alexandria heard the muffled thump-thump of slippers, the brushing of arms along the hallway wall, and the short melodic hum Naomi always made when she was excited about something. "You're up early," Alexandria called gently, not turning around but already smiling. "I thought I'd have to drag you out of bed." Naomi slid into the kitchen with her curls still tangled from sleep, wearing her favorite oversized hoodie with the Harvard crest across the chest, the one she'd only started wearing yesterday ever since the acceptance email came in. "I couldn't sleep," Naomi said, eyes bright, voice still a little husky. "I kept thinking about what Mom would have said." Alexandria's hand froze for half a second above the skillet, then continued as if nothing had happened. She would have said, "You were always meant to change the world, baby girl. You're just getting started." Naomi sank into the barstool legs, crossed elbows on the counter, watching her mother, with the same admiration Alexandria had once given her own mother, before the world demanded more of her than it should have. For a moment, they just looked at each other, saying nothing, letting the weight of years, the grief, the survival, the small victories speak for itself. "You know," Naomi said after a beat, "they want me to start early. Summer pre-med program. 2 weeks ahead of schedule." Alexandria turned, holding a plate in one hand and a mug of tea in the other, setting them down gently before her daughter. "Do you want to go?" Naomi nodded. "I do. I think I'm ready." Alexandria pulled out the stool beside her and sat folding her hands in front of her, the lines on her knuckles, a quiet testament to time and battle. "Then we make it happen. We'll drive down next weekend, walk the campus, check out your dorm, make a weekend of it." Outside, birds called across the yard, and the wind rustled the oak leaves with a gentle, steady sigh, like the land itself was exhaling. The house felt wrapped in safety, in familiarity, in the kind of quiet that only ever feels precious once you've known its opposite. Alexandria watched Naomi eat, noting the ease in her posture, the way she swayed slightly to music. Only she could hear the way she bit the edge of her lip when thinking through something big. She thought of how much her daughter had grown in the past 3 years, especially since her father passed, and how Naomi had carried that loss with a kind of grace that made Alexandria feel both proud and guilty. "She's stronger than I was at 17, she thought then, caught herself because strength isn't always a choice. Sometimes it's a sentence. After breakfast, they cleared the table together in silence, a practiced dance of hands and glances, and Alexandria felt that familiar pang of watching her child prepare to leave the nest, pride and ache mixed in equal measure. Naomi grabbed her basketball from the porch and began dribbling it in the driveway, the steady bounce, bounce, bounce echoing like a heartbeat, like something alive and persistent. Alexandria stood by the screen door, one hand resting against the frame, watching her daughter twirl, pivot, laugh, her silhouette framed in the morning sun. And for a moment time bent. She wasn't a soldier or a widow or even a mother. She was simply a witness to possibility, to joy, to a child who believed the world would always make room for her brilliance. She knew that wouldn't always be true, but she let herself believe it anyway. Just for today. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the Georgian treetops, casting long amber streaks across the winding road that cut through their quiet neighborhood like a familiar seam in well-worn fabric. Alexandria adjusted the rear-view mirror out of habit, not because she needed it. She knew this route, like she knew the shape of her daughter's hand, like she knew every knot in the wooden banister Naomi used to slide down when she was 7. Beside her, Naomi sat glowing in a soft blue dress she'd saved for something special, the kind of soft satin that caught light like it had secrets to whisper. Her smile came easy tonight, and Alexandria couldn't help but glance over between stop signs, marveling at how her baby girl, her reason, her second heartbeat, had somehow become this poised, radiant young woman without her even noticing it happening. "Do you think we'll have time to stop by the bookstore after dinner?" Naomi asked, spinning one of her bracelets slowly around her wrist, a habit she had when her mind was turning faster than her mouth. "I saw this anatomy review guide they just restocked." Alexandria laughed softly, the sound low and full. "Only you would want to spend your celebration browsing muscle diagrams," she said, but her voice held no mockery, only warmth. "You're your mother's daughter through and through." Naomi smiled again, eyes flicking toward the window, catching glimpses of the world rushing by. "I want to be ready," she murmured, almost to herself. "I don't want to just show up at Harvard. I want to belong there." The car hummed steadily beneath them, its tires gently thudding over the seams in the road, the kind of quiet rhythm that can lull you into a sense of safety, a sense of place. The air outside still held the breath of summer, warm and golden, and the sky was painted in deep orange tones that gave everything a certain softness. Alexandria felt it too, that peaceful lull, that rare sense of everything being okay. She reached for the volume knob and turned the jazz station down just a little, allowing the silence between them to settle like a favorite blanket, familiar and intimate. They were just 3 miles from the restaurant now, Zola's, Naomi's favorite spot, the one with the honey-glazed salmon and warm rosemary bread, and Alexandria had already imagined the toast she'd give, rehearsed the exact moment she would hand over the tiny gold necklace she'd kept hidden in her purse since morning. Then she saw them. Flashing blue and red lights burst into view in the rear-view mirror, slicing through the calm like a blade through silk, strobing violently against the windshield, and roof pulsing in irregular beats that made her grip tighten on the steering wheel before her mind had even caught up. She instinctively lifted her foot off the gas and signaled right, pulling over with slow, deliberate caution, heart rate quickening, though her mind insisted she hadn't done anything wrong. Naomi stopped mid-sentence, her voice trailing off as the flashing lights washed across her face. "Were you speeding?" she asked quietly, her brows knitting together. Alexandria shook her head. "Not even close," she said calmly, though her stomach had begun to tighten. "Keep your hands visible. Don't move too quickly. Let me talk first." The patrol car stopped behind them, its headlights casting long shadows across the asphalt. Alexandria could see the silhouette of one officer stepping out, then another, both white, both tall, one resting his hand on his belt like it was instinct rather than choice. She rolled down her window halfway, placing both hands firmly on the steering wheel, her back straight, and still her voice, ready, calm, respectful, measured. Naomi did the same beside her, her phone resting on her thigh, her breath held tight in her chest. The officer approached slowly, his boots crunching gravel and dried leaves. As he came into view, his partner circling wide to the passenger side, like this was something other than a simple traffic stop. "License and registration," the first officer barked without greeting or context, his voice sharp enough to cut. Alexandria nodded, reached slowly toward her glove compartment with exaggerated care, narrating her movements out loud. "I'm reaching for my registration now, officer. My license is in my wallet left pocket." The second officer tapped on Naomi's window with 2 fingers, the motion fast and impatient, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. "Where are you headed, all dressed up?" he asked, eyes fixed on Naomi's dress, her face, her dark skin. Naomi answered, soft but clear. "We're going to dinner. I got accepted to Harvard. Summer pre-med program." Neither officer responded to her words. The first officer examined Alexandria's license like it was an artifact of questionable origin, his lip curling just slightly at the edges. "Step out of the car, ma'am," he ordered suddenly. Alexandria hesitated just a breath before replying. "Is there a problem, officer?" He didn't answer, only repeated the command louder. She looked over at Naomi, who was now gripping the edge of her seat, her eyes wide but dry. Do exactly what I do, Alexandria whispered, before stepping out with the same precision she once used exiting helicopters in combat zones. Hands up, back straight, no sudden moves. Then she heard Naomi's door open. The second officer was ordering her out now, too, voice raised tone, urgent and invasive. She's 17, Alexandria said, turning her head but not moving. She's a minor. Keep quiet, the first officer snapped, pushing Alexandria toward the hood of the car. She complied, jaw-tight, pulse thudding behind her ears. In her peripheral vision she saw Naomi being positioned next to her, hands against the car chin, lifted in defiance. I'm recording this, Naomi said, slowly reaching for her phone. We have the right to document this interaction. That was the moment the air changed. The officer lunged. Alexandria saw the movement before she registered the sound, a shout, then a scream, then the clatter of a phone hitting pavement. Her body jerked as instinct surged her hands, shooting up again, her voice hoarse with panic. She's not resisting, please don't hurt her. But it was too late, everything moved too fast and too violently. One officer screamed something about a weapon, the other reached. 2 shots fired into the golden light. Naomi's body crumpled like paper. And the sound that left Alexandria's throat wasn't human. She collapsed to her knees, hands bound, arms restrained, eyes fixed on the single drop of blood that trickled from Naomi's temple to the blacktop below, perfect round and endlessly red. The silence that followed the gunshots was not quiet at all. It was the kind of silence that screamed, pierced, swallowed everything in its path, like a black hole collapsing inward. Alexandria couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't form a single coherent thought as her knees buckled beneath her, the impact of bone on pavement, jarring but meaningless compared to the sight in front of her. Naomi's body lay still on the warm asphalt, one arm curled awkwardly beneath her, her hair splayed like a halo of shadows around her head, her blue dress now stained in places with a color too bright, too red, too wrong. For a brief moment, Alexandria's mind refused to accept what her eyes saw, because nothing about it made sense. Not the way Naomi had smiled just minutes ago, not the soft cadence of her voice, not the hope that had danced in her words about the future. She tried to crawl toward her daughter, her wrists still bound behind her, her face scraping the pavement as she dragged herself inch by inch with a desperation that was more instinct than thought. Let me help her, she gasped, the words coming out broken and raw, barely recognizable as her own. One of the officers barked at her to stay down, but she didn't care, didn't even hear him fully. She only saw Naomi's eyes still open, staring at the sky, as if trying to find something beyond it, as if caught mid-thought. Naomi, Alexandria whispered, her voice trembling with all the years of motherhood wrapped into a single shattered breath. I'm here, baby, I'm here. The hands that yanked her backward were rough, indifferent, impersonal, the same way you'd move furniture or trash, not a mother watching her child bleed out in front of her. The officer's knee pressed into her back, sharp and hard, while the cuffs bit deeper into her skin, and still she kept her eyes on Naomi, as though her gaze alone could keep her daughter tethered to the world a few seconds longer. Traffic had stopped on both sides, now headlights flickering, horns, quieted people frozen in place as witnesses without knowing what to do, whether to help or to film or to pray. The air smelled of metal and burnt rubber, of panic and summer dust, of something sacred being broken in a way that could never be mended. Blood spread slowly from under Naomi's shoulder, a dark flower blooming on the pavement beneath her, and Alexandria's stomach twisted at the thought that the only warm thing touching her daughter now was the road. She heard someone yelling into a radio officer down civilian unresponsive need EMS on site, but it sounded more like procedure than urgency, like they were reading from a manual instead of reacting to a human being's life slipping away in real time. No one moved to help. No one knelt beside Naomi to stop the bleeding. No one dared to look Alexandria in the eye. When the ambulance finally arrived, sirens blaring in the distance like a cruel echo of the earlier gunfire, Alexandria had already stopped crying. Her tears had dried on her cheeks, her lips pressed into a line too tight to tremble, her eyes red but dry. She watched them load Naomi's body onto the gurney, not with the care of medics tending to a patient, but with the careful detachment of people handling a case that was already lost. She's just a child, Alexandria said again, this time to no one, her voice barely louder than a breath. She was just a child. They didn't let her ride in the ambulance. They didn't uncuff her wrists. They didn't tell her where they were taking her daughter. Instead, they placed her in the back of a cruiser, the door shutting with a finality that made her shoulders slump. She sat in silence, forehead against the window, watching the lights smear across the glass like smudges on a memory. She didn't ask questions anymore. She didn't beg. Something in her had gone quiet, not in surrender but in suspension, like a bowstring, pulled back so tightly it could no longer tremble. At the station, they booked her like any other suspect: fingerprints, mugshot, basic questions delivered with clinical detachment. No one mentioned Naomi. No one offered a blanket or a glass of water, or even a moment to sit and breathe. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed relentlessly, humming like an insect in her skull, and Alexandria felt her focus splintering in 100 directions she couldn't chase. Time passed without her consent, and when they finally led her to an interrogation room, it felt like entering a different kind of battlefield, one where the weapons were silence and suspicion, and truth was just another casualty. The walls were bare, the table cold, the chair too rigid to provide comfort. She sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring at the blank wall opposite her, refusing to let her thoughts drift toward the what-ifs. If Naomi hadn't reached for her phone, if Alexandria had driven a different route, if the officer hadn't been so quick to pull his weapon, if the most dangerous word in the world when you've just lost everything. Eventually, a man in a cheap blazer walked in with a file tucked under his arm and a face that looked like it had practiced neutrality in the mirror. He sat down slowly, flipping open the folder with deliberate care, and cleared his throat, as if the act of addressing her was somehow a burden. "Mrs. Cole," he began, "we need your statement about what happened tonight." She didn't answer at first, just stared at the folder in front of him like it might somehow open wide enough to contain all that she felt, all that had been stolen from her. "My daughter was recording everything," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "Where is her phone?" He didn't flinch. No phone was recovered at the scene. Her lips parted, then closed. "That's impossible," she said, leaning forward just slightly. "She was recording. I saw her drop it." He nodded as if acknowledging a minor inconvenience. "According to the officer's statements, your daughter made a sudden movement which Officer Grant interpreted as a threat." Alexandria's hands curled into fists beneath the table, her knuckles paling under pressure. "She was 17, she said, her voice now harder, edged with disbelief. "She told you she got into Harvard. She was going to dinner with her mother." "I understand this is difficult," the man replied, still expressionless, "but the investigation will determine whether any misconduct occurred." She laughed once, sharp, humorless. "Misconduct, she's dead." The man closed the folder and stood. "We'll be in touch." As he left, Alexandria stared at the door long after it closed, the echo of its latch ringing louder than anything he had said. She leaned back in the chair, spine pressed against the cold metal eyes fixed on the ceiling, and breathed in through her nose, slow and deep. Her heart was beating again now, not fast, not panicked, but with a deliberate rhythm, as if it had recalibrated to something new. Not grief, not fury, not even survival. Resolve. And in that sterile, windowless room, where the hum of the lights never stopped, and the world had gone impossibly quiet, Captain Alexandria Cole made herself a promise. Not out loud, not for them, but for Naomi, and it would begin with remembering exactly how still the air had felt the moment her daughter's heartbeat stopped. The morning after Naomi's death did not begin with light or sound or memory, it began with absence thick and shapeless, pressing into Alexandria's lungs like wet cloth. The interrogation room was silent now, its corners harsh with shadows and sterile white light, a flickering bulb above casting pale loops across the scratched metal table. No one had spoken to her in hours, not even to offer water, not even to ask how she was holding up. She sat perfectly still in the hard chair, her wrists red from the handcuffs earlier, her body aching not from force but from the weight of being awake through the longest night of her life. Across from her, the table remained empty except for a small file folder someone had left behind, closed and anonymous like everything else in this place. She had learned how to sit through silence years ago in debriefings, in desert tents, in rooms filled with men who measured every word. But this silence was different. It wasn't strategic, it wasn't planned. It was designed to wear her down, to remind her that she had no power here, no rank, no command. She glanced at the wall clock, its second hand, ticking with ruthless indifference, and calculated how long it had been since she last saw Naomi's face. She didn't want to count the hours, but her mind insisted anyway, because a mother's grief doesn't sleep and a soldier's training doesn't forget. When the door finally opened, it wasn't an apology that walked in. It was Detective Clarence, a man with soft shoes and a neutral expression, the kind that could make a death sound like paperwork. He sat without a word, opened the file, and looked at her as if he expected something. "We need your statement," he said plainly, as if that was the most pressing thing in the world. Alexandria didn't blink. "Where's my daughter's phone?" she asked, her voice low but sharp, the kind that cuts deeper than shouting. The detective didn't flinch. There was no phone recovered at the scene. That was a lie, and they both knew it. She could still hear it, Naomi's voice saying she was going to record the encounter, the phone falling, the sound of it skidding across the ground. It was there. She saw it. She was recording, Alexandria said, eyes locked on his. She said so out loud. There were witnesses. Clarence flipped a page, barely listening or pretending not to. "According to the officers, your daughter made a sudden movement. Officer Grant reacted in accordance with departmental policy." That phrase, so polished, so rehearsed, landed like a stone in her chest. She breathed in slowly, her knuckles tightening in her lap. "He shot an unarmed girl at point-blank range. That's not policy, that's murder." Clarence closed the file and stood. "This is a difficult time. I understand that. But we recommend you refrain from making public accusations." She didn't respond. She had nothing left to say to someone who could speak about Naomi like she was a complication to manage a case to close. When he left, the silence didn't return. It never left, it simply thickened again, as if drawing strength from the space her daughter used to fill. Later they released her without fanfare. No one offered condolences. No one even looked her in the eyes. She walked out of the police station into sunlight that felt like it belonged to someone else, into a world that kept turning as if nothing had happened. Her friend Thomas, a former military lawyer turned civil rights advocate, was already waiting at the curb, his face pale, jaw clenched. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, voice trembling beneath its control. "My God, Alex, Naomi." He reached for her and she let him hold her, not because it changed anything, but because her knees might have failed without him. She didn't cry, not yet. The grief was too fresh, too sharp, too frozen to melt into tears. It would come later, she knew, when the world was quiet again. When there were no more questions, no more files, no more lies to swallow whole. At home, the stillness was unbearable. Naomi's shoes were still by the door. Her backpack leaned against the couch. A science textbook lay open on the table, a yellow highlighter caught mid-sentence, like she had just stepped out for a moment. Alexandria touched the book's edge, then pulled her hand back, suddenly afraid to disturb the air around it, as if her daughter's breath still lingered somewhere close. She walked through the house slowly, room by room, not looking for anything in particular, just needing to see proof that Naomi had really been here, had really lived here, had not just been a dream she would now have to learn to live without. In her daughter's bedroom, sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, casting a pattern of leaves on the pale walls. Posters of science fairs and photos from the basketball team decorated the space. Her laptop sat on the desk, still open, the cursor blinking patiently on an unfinished scholarship essay. Alexandria sat down in the desk chair, her body folding into itself, her arms wrapping tightly around her middle, as if she could hold her heart together just a little longer. She stayed that way for what felt like hours. Then, as the sun began to fall behind the trees again, her breath found rhythm. Not peace, not comfort, but rhythm. She stood and walked back into the living room, picked up Naomi's backpack and set it gently in her lap. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, checking each pocket, each compartment, as if expecting something she couldn't name. The phone wasn't there. She already knew it wouldn't be, but it didn't stop her from searching. It wasn't about hope. It was about clarity. Because now she understood. The system wasn't failing. It was functioning exactly as designed. The night Naomi died, Alexandria didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, because the quiet no longer meant peace. It meant something was missing, something fundamental and irreplaceable. She sat alone in the living room long after the sun had vanished behind the horizon, bathed only in the blue glow of the desk lamp, her body motionless except for the slow rise and fall of her chest. The walls felt closer now, the furniture heavier, the very air around her charged with a strange tension, as if the house itself was bracing for what came next. Her phone had vibrated several times over the last hour, mostly messages from friends and fellow veterans offering condolences, or from reporters asking for statements she had no intention of giving. But Alexandria wasn't interested in sympathy or sound bites. She wanted truth, and she wanted proof. Her eyes drifted to Naomi's laptop, still sitting open on the kitchen counter, the same place her daughter had left it that morning, its screen dark but not yet asleep. She rose slowly, not from weakness, but from the weight of certainty, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor as she crossed the space between grief and something harder, something focused. With a gentle touch, she tapped the spacebar and the screen lit up instantly, asking for a password she already knew by heart. Naomi had never hidden anything from her mother, not her ambitions, not her fears, not even the places where those two things overlap. The desktop was a familiar mixture of color-coded folders, open documents and browser tabs, college applications, science articles, annotated videos of basketball games. But what caught Alexandria's eye wasn't any of those things. It was a single folder tucked neatly in the corner of the screen marked with one word, emergency. Her throat tightened as she double-clicked it, revealing a lone video file dated the night of the traffic stop. Her fingers hesitated over the trackpad not because she was afraid of what she'd see, but because part of her already knew. When the footage began to play, it was shaky at first, captured from Naomi's phone as she placed it upright on the dashboard, recording both the front windshield and the voices within the car. The timestamp matched the time of the stop, and Alexandria's breath caught as she heard her own voice calmly explaining their location, her own words echoing back at her from just hours earlier. Then came the flashing lights, the officer's voice barking orders, the confusion, the tension that rose like a tide that could no longer be turned back. She watched herself exit the car with deliberate, rehearsed care, watched Naomi's hands, raised and visible, heard her daughter say clearly, and without aggression, "I'm going to record this." And then, unmistakably, Officer Grant's voice, "Put that down." The video captured his footsteps approaching, the sound of his belt, shifting, the sudden sharp movement of his arm, and then the moment everything shattered, Naomi's scream, the crack of the gunshot, and the phone tumbling to the pavement. The screen went black, but the audio kept running, catching every panicked shout, every cruel instruction, every second of Alexandria's agony. When the file ended, she didn't move. Not for a long time. She just sat there, hands gripping the edges of the counter, eyes fixed on the screen that had just confirmed what she already knew, but had still hoped might not be true. They had lied. They had said there was no phone, no footage, no evidence. But Naomi had known. Her daughter had known. Somehow, in the seconds before everything fell apart, Naomi had anticipated what might happen and had made sure that someone would see it. Alexandria backed up the file to an external drive, then uploaded it to a secure cloud folder under an alias she hadn't used in years, one built during covert deployments overseas, back when her survival depended on disappearing, and her voice had to carry without ever being traced. She sent the file to two trusted contacts. One, a retired JAG officer, now working in civil liberties law. The other, a tech journalist who specialized in digital corruption cases. Then she turned off the laptop and stood in the stillness again, a different kind of stillness this time. This was not the stillness of loss. This was the stillness before action. Her pulse had slowed, her breath evened out, her thoughts aligning like soldiers before a mission. She was no longer stumbling through grief. She was standing inside of it, aware of its shape and power, and choosing to carry it forward. This wasn't just about Naomi anymore. It was about the lie they had tried to write into her daughter's legacy, and Alexandria would not let that be the final word. She walked upstairs and entered Naomi's room, where the scent of lavender and laundry soap still lingered in the air. On the dresser next to a framed photo of the two of them from a science fair years ago sat Naomi's silver bracelet, the one she always wore for good luck. Alexandria picked it up and turned it over in her palm, the metal still warm from the day the engraving inside nearly worn smooth, always forward. It had been her gift to Naomi on her 15th birthday. 3 words, a motto, a promise. As she stood there cradling the bracelet, she felt something return to her, not strength, not yet, but the memory of what strength felt like. It didn't come from anger. It didn't come from vengeance. It came from knowing that what you were about to do mattered, not because it would change the world, but because it would refuse to let the world change your truth. She slipped the bracelet into her pocket, walked back downstairs, and began writing names on a sheet of paper, people she needed to call, people who wouldn't ask stupid questions, people who understood that justice isn't always found in a courtroom. The air around her felt different now, like the house itself understood. No more waiting. No more hoping the system would correct itself. Because Naomi had already done her part. Now it was Alexandria's turn. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of Alexandria's laptop as it processed the footage Naomi had left behind, proof undeniable and damning that what had happened on that road was not a misunderstanding, not a tragic accident, but something far colder, She sat in her daughter's old desk chair, her back straight, eyes fixed on the screen, as she clicked through frame by frame, rewinding small moments to study the details. The way the officer's hand moved before Naomi's did, the way his partner watched without stepping in, the way the world seemed to collapse, with a sound no louder than thunder muffled by grief. Her jaw tightened with each passing second, not in rage but in clarity, because the more she saw, the more she realized this wasn't a single crack in the system. It was the system working exactly as it was meant to. Later that afternoon, she called Thomas and asked him for names, not reporters, not politicians, but people who had spent years digging into departments like this one. He listened in silence, then said, "There's a woman I want you to talk to. Her name's Jenna Wu. Tech investigator, obsessive about corruption, and the only person I know who's not afraid of public records." Within hours, Alexandria was seated across from Jenna in a corner booth of a quiet diner on the south side of town, her laptop already open, her fingers moving with speed and confidence. "Give me the badge number," Jenna said simply without looking up. Alexandria didn't hesitate. "Grant. Officer Bradley Grant, Savannah PD." Jenna typed for less than 30 seconds before her expression changed just slightly, but enough for Alexandria to notice. "There's something here," Jenna murmured, scrolling through a cluster of digital records like she'd been doing this her whole life. 7 complaints of excessive force, she said, all filed by Black or Latino citizens, all dismissed. Alexandria leaned forward, her fingers curled slightly on the edge of the table, voice calm but edged. "Anything formal?" Jenna nodded. 2 internal investigations. One involved a broken wrist on a 15-year-old. No charges. One involved a woman thrown through a store window. The body cam footage went missing. Sound familiar? Alexandria's silence was her answer. Jenna kept digging, pulling up personnel records, disciplinary reports, and patterns hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy. "Look at this," she said, turning the laptop toward her. "Grant's partner, Sullivan. He's registered as a part-time contractor with a private security firm that just renewed its city contract 3 months ago." Alexandria's brow furrowed, her thoughts already leaping ahead. "So the same officer who stood by while my daughter was murdered also gets paid by a company that supplies tactical training to the police?" Jenna nodded. "Exactly. And that company has ties to a regional holding group that funnels money into law enforcement innovation programs across the state." The pieces were starting to fall into place. Ugly, crooked pieces that connected power, profit, and violence, like they'd always belonged together. Alexandria stared at the screen, at the maze of names and departments and contracts. So when they said it was a mistake, what they really meant was it was business as usual. Jenna looked up then, and for the first time since they met, her face softened. That's exactly what they meant. They sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of it settle in. Outside, the sky had turned slate gray, the kind of heavy southern overcast that made everything feel suspended in time. Cars passed by the window in a slow rhythm, their tires whispering against the wet pavement. Alexandria took a sip of coffee that had long gone cold, her eyes unfocused, her body still. "My daughter was supposed to start Harvard in 6 weeks, she said softly, her voice steady but hollow. She worked her whole life for that, and in under 60 seconds they erased it like it meant nothing. Jenna didn't respond right away. She simply closed her laptop, then reached into her bag and handed Alexandria a flash drive. "This is everything I found so far. It's encrypted and I'll keep digging. But if you want the public to listen, we need more than records. We need pattern, we need context, and we need someone willing to say it out loud." Alexandria took the flash drive without hesitation, her grip firm, her gaze unwavering. "Then let's find them." That evening she returned home not to rest but to prepare. She cleared Naomi's desk, gathered old notebooks, pulled out files from her own military records, every report, every contact, every favor she hadn't yet called in. She created a board in the living room, pinning up names and dates and connections with lines of string like she'd once done during field missions overseas. This wasn't a vendetta, this was intelligence gathering. A mother's war room. A quiet declaration that she was not going to let her daughter's name be buried beneath the silence of official statements and procedural shield. The house had changed again, not back to what it was when Naomi was alive. Not into a tomb for grief, but into something sharper, clearer, a place where truth would be built piece by piece until the weight of it collapsed everything that tried to stand in its way. And for the first time since that night, Alexandria felt something close to purpose begin to rise from beneath the rubble of her sorrow. The first sign that someone was watching came 2 days after Alexandria uploaded the video to the secure servers and handed copies to Jenna and Thomas, 2 days after she began mapping connections between badge numbers and backroom contracts, and just hours after she spoke with a journalist who agreed to view the footage only to go silent the next morning. It started small, like most threats do, with something meant to be subtle but unmistakably deliberate. A single crow, freshly dead, placed on her front porch before sunrise, its black feathers wet with dew, its neck broken cleanly, as if snapped by a practiced hand. Next to it, a piece of folded notebook paper. No envelope, no handwriting, just 5 words typed in bold, even letters. Accidents happen to the loud ones. She didn't call the police. Not because she wasn't scared she was, but because she already knew how that would go. Instead, she picked up the crow with gloved hands, placed it gently in a trash bag, and slipped the note into a folder already thick with timelines, printouts, and photographs. She took a picture of the scene, time-stamped it, then checked the exterior camera feed she'd installed the night after Naomi's death. The footage between 2:07 and 2:14 a.m. was mysteriously corrupted, just static. Nothing before, nothing after. Clean, precise, professional. By the end of that week, someone spray-painted the word LIAR across her garage door in red, thick, angry strokes, dripping like blood. The same night, a rock shattered her kitchen window while she was making tea, the glass exploding across the tile floor in 1,000 tiny shards that sparkled under the overhead light like they belonged there. She didn't scream. She didn't even move at first. She just stood still, letting the silence settle around her again, the only sound the slow, steady dripping of tea from the counter to the floor. When the responding officer finally arrived, he moved through her home with the bored detachment of someone performing a routine. He barely looked at the broken glass. He didn't dust for prints. He didn't write down much of anything. Probably just kids, he said, with a shrug, eyes flicking toward the garage like it wasn't his problem. Some people don't like all the attention you've been getting. Alexandria looked at him carefully, then her voice quiet but firm. It's only attention if you think speaking the truth is a performance. The officer didn't reply. He just nodded, offered a dismissive, "We'll file a report," and walked back to his cruiser without another word. That night, she reinforced the locks, double-checked every window, and stayed downstairs until sunrise, with her service pistol on the coffee table and Naomi's photo beside it. The next morning, she found her tires slashed deep, clean cuts through the rubber, symmetrical, like they'd been done with a practiced blade. Her hands shook as she dialed Jenna's number, not from fear but from something worse. Exhaustion, the kind that creeps in when you realize you're being targeted, not because you did something wrong, but because you dared to refuse silence. "I think they're trying to wear me down," she said, when Jenna answered, her voice brittle from too many sleepless nights. "It's working." Jenna didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was different, lower, more deliberate. "They wouldn't be this scared unless you were right over the target." Alexandria leaned against the kitchen counter, staring out the window at the empty street, the same one Naomi used to jog down every Saturday morning. "Then why does it feel like I'm the one losing ground?" The question hung in the air longer than either of them liked. And then, as if to underline her doubt, Alexandria opened her inbox to find an anonymous message with no subject line and no body, just a single attachment. A screenshot of her living room window, the one she'd been sitting in front of when she called Jenna. The photo was taken from across the street, zoomed in, grainy but unmistakable. She was in frame, blurred slightly but centered. Behind her, barely visible through the curtains, was Naomi's photo on the mantel. The implication was clear: "We see you. We see all of you." She didn't flinch. Not outwardly. She saved the image, printed it twice, one copy for the folder, one for the wall, and then sat down with a pen and a new sheet of paper. The list she began wasn't of suspects. It was of names she needed to protect. Thomas, Jenna, the neighbor 2 houses down who sometimes watched her place when she traveled, the barista at the coffee shop who'd quietly slipped her a handwritten note that said thank you for fighting for her. No one was out of reach. Not anymore. That evening she found herself staring at Naomi's bracelet again, the silver one with the engraving so worn you had to tilt it toward the light to read the words, "Always forward." The phrase had meant something different back then when she gave it to her daughter as a quiet encouragement. But now it pulsed like an instruction. Not vengeance. Not retreat. Just forward. She breathed in slowly, felt her lungs expand with something that wasn't rage or sorrow but resolve. Whatever came next, threats, slander, surveillance, it wouldn't be enough to silence her. Because Naomi had believed the world could be better. And Alexandria wasn't going to let fear be the final chapter in her daughter's story. Not while she was still standing. Not while she still had breath in her body and truth in her hands. It was a Thursday morning when the past came, knocking not with violence, not with threats, but with steady footsteps and a voice that had once belonged to another life. Alexandria was in her backyard, trimming the hedges along the fence line, letting the rhythm of small, ordinary tasks calm her breath when she heard the front gate creak open. Her hand paused, mid-cut the shears still hovering in the air, and for a moment she considered pretending not to hear, just to enjoy a few more minutes in the quiet that hadn't yet been interrupted by phone calls, coded emails, or subtle threats. But something in the heaviness of those steps felt familiar, not dangerous, not urgent, but known. She turned slowly and came around the corner, just in time to see General Samuel Green, retired commander of the 3rd Special Forces Group. Longtime friend of her late husband, and one of the few people she trusted, without condition, standing at the bottom of her porch steps, his dress slacks pressed crisp, his brown hands folded loosely in front of him, and his eyes shaded by the brim of a well-worn cap. "You've been busy," he said gently, voice calm but edged with quiet concern. Alexandria nodded, once wiping her hands on the towel tucked into her waistband. "You didn't come all the way from Raleigh to admire my landscaping, Sam." He offered a faint smile, the kind you give someone when there are too many things you can't say yet. "Mind if I come in?" She held the door open and gestured him inside her shoulders, relaxing slightly as he passed. He moved through her home like someone who knew every corner of it, which he did there. Had been cookouts, holidays, funerals, years of memory baked into the furniture and faded photos. But today his eyes didn't linger on the mantel or the bookshelves. They went straight to the wall, covered in string notes and printed screenshots. Her war map. He stood silently before it for a full minute before speaking. "I got a call," he said, his voice lower now, "from someone I know at the Department of Justice. They flagged your name, not officially, not yet, but they're watching." Alexandria crossed her arms, steadying herself. "Good. Maybe they'll finally see what's been buried under their silence." Sam turned to look at her fully, his expression unreadable. "That's not how they see it, Alex. They think you're escalating. They think you're unstable." She didn't flinch. She had heard that before from detectives, from news anchors, from strangers on the internet who'd never held their dying child in their arms. "Do you think I'm unstable?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. He didn't answer right away. "I think you're grieving," he said finally. "And I think you're carrying this alone because you've forgotten how to let anyone else hold the weight with you." She looked down at the floor for a moment, then back up. "I can't afford to let anyone else hold it. People get hurt when they stand too close." Sam walked over to the table and picked up a printed still from the footage, Grant's face mid-shout, half-shadowed by his patrol car's lights. "What you're doing isn't wrong," he said, placing the paper down with care. "But it's dangerous, and not just to you. I've seen careers end over less. I've seen lives end over less." She met his gaze with the steady calm of someone who'd already considered all of that and decided to keep going anyway. "Then help me make sure it's worth it." Something in that sentence shifted the air between them. Sam pulled out a chair and sat, placing a leather folder on the table and sliding it toward her. "This is everything I could pull without triggering official eyes," he said. "Internal affairs records, state audits, unreleased complaints. It's not complete, but it's enough to start burning holes in the dam." She opened the folder, slowly leafing through names and dates she had only half confirmed until now, her heart beginning to race not with panic but with recognition. These were the puzzle pieces she hadn't known how to find. "Why now?" she asked, not looking up. "Why bring this to me today?" Sam leaned back, his arms crossed loosely. "Because someone tried to silence your daughter, and they're trying to silence you. But what they didn't count on was how many of us have been waiting for someone like you to call it out loud." He paused, his voice steady. "You're not the only one who's tired of pretending the system isn't rigged." Alexandria exhaled slowly, her fingers resting on the documents, as if grounding herself to something solid. "I didn't plan to lead anything. I just wanted them to admit what they did." Sam shook his head. "That's the thing about truth. Once you chase it, people start following even if you never meant to lead." They sat in silence for a while, two soldiers long retired from battle, now drawn back into a different kind of war. The late afternoon sun filtered through the window blinds, casting long, golden stripes across the hardwood floor and the folder that lay between them. Outside, a breeze stirred the wind chimes on the porch into a low, thoughtful murmur. Inside, Alexandria felt something shift, not a release of pain, not the lifting of grief, but a widening of purpose. She looked at the names written on her wall, at the red thread stretching across departments and dates and buried reports. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was standing at the edge of something impossible. She felt like the beginning of something real. And in that moment, with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent her life moving toward fire rather than away from it, Alexandria picked up a pen, circled a name on the printout, and said, "Only this. Let's begin." Raymond Shaw didn't waste time on pleasantries. He never had, not in war zones, not in newsrooms, and certainly not when standing in the doorway of a woman who had just buried her only child. He was tall, wiry, with a face carved by decades of stories too ugly to print and too real to forget. When Alexandria opened the door, he simply held up a flash drive. No words, just a nod that said, "I brought something." She let him in without speaking, guiding him past the photographs, the fading flowers, and the silent ache that now lived in every corner of her home. They sat at the kitchen table like soldiers in a bunker, quiet, alert, preparing for the next move without needing to say it out loud. Raymond pulled a laptop from his bag, opened it with practiced ease, and clicked through a sequence of folders with names that meant nothing to most but everything to the people paying attention. "I started following this 3 years ago," he said, his voice low and even. "After a shooting in Meridian, same pattern, same type of cover-up, and the same private firm hiding behind it all." He slid the laptop toward her, the screen filled with charts, documents, scanned invoices, surveillance stills. "I traced 3 different shell companies back to a parent firm called Falchion Strategies, which provides tactical consultation to over 60 police departments across the Southeast." Alexandria leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as the connections began to crystallize. "What kind of consultation?" she asked, already guessing the answer. "The kind that turns local police into paramilitary units," Raymond said. "Weapons, tactics, crowd control models. But there's more. They also handle data suppression, body cam protocols, real-time footage, diversion, civilian tracking." He clicked open a contract signed between the Savannah Police Department and a vendor called Graymark Solutions, a name that hadn't appeared in any of her public records searches. Graymark is a front. Falchion operates behind it. And guess whose name shows up on the payout ledger? Alexandria didn't speak. She didn't have to. Raymond continued. "Officer Sullivan, the quiet one. He's been getting direct deposits from a consulting stipend tied to tactical demonstrations. They list him as a training evaluator, which means effectively he gets bonuses for enforcing field protocols that Falchion designs." Her mouth tightened, her pulse steady, but her breath shallower now. "So Naomi wasn't just in the wrong place," she said quietly. "She was in someone's operation." Raymond nodded once. "Exactly. They've militarized city blocks and turned traffic stops into exercises. Your daughter was caught in a machine she didn't even know existed." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with understanding, with the slow settling of horror that no longer felt like chaos but strategy. Alexandria stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street, at the sunlight, slipping across her front yard, at the neighbor's child bouncing a basketball just like Naomi used to. "How many people have they done this to?" she asked without turning around. "Too many," Raymond said, "but only a few who left a video behind, and even fewer whose mothers fought back this hard." She stayed still for a long moment, then turned, her eyes clearer now. "We need to expose this, not just locally, not just one name at a time." Raymond nodded, closing the laptop. "I've been talking to a contact at an international outlet. They'll take the story. But we'll need airtight records, testimony, and a witness who can't be bought or scared into silence." Alexandria picked up Naomi's bracelet from the counter, tracing the worn engraving with her thumb. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "They already took everything they could from me." Raymond reached into his coat pocket and placed a sealed envelope on the table. "One more thing," he said. "This is a police memo. Unofficial. A leak. It describes a new program, one that expands Falchion's model to civilian surveillance in neighborhoods they label high risk. Your block was listed. Naomi's stop wasn't random. It was a checkpoint. They were testing something." Alexandria's breath hitched a small intake like someone stepping into cold water. They used my daughter to test a system, she asked, almost in disbelief. Raymond didn't look away. Yes. She sat down slowly, the chair creaking beneath her like it had aged 10 years in a moment. Her hands rested on the envelope, but she didn't open it. She didn't need to, not yet. What she needed now was time to let her thoughts catch up to the speed of the truth. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past, music thumping softly through its open window. A dog barked down the street. Life, uncaring and unchanged, kept going. Inside, Alexandria stared at the table for several minutes, her mind sorting through timelines, names, angles of attack. When she finally looked up, her voice was steady again. I want to go after Falchion. I want to go after every department that used their training and every official that signed off on it. Raymond smiled, not out of joy, but from the rare recognition that comes when someone steps fully into a role they were born for. Then let's bring it down, he said. And in that small kitchen, with the smell of old coffee lingering and the past bleeding into the present, two people who had seen too much and lost even more made a choice. Not to hope, not to plead, but to fight with documentation, with evidence, with voices raised so loud the silence would have nowhere left to hide. And as Alexandria reached for a pen, drawing a line through Sullivan's name on her board and circling the word Falchion twice in thick red ink, she didn't feel fear. She felt direction. The storm came quietly, not with thunder or wind, but in the form of a neatly typed report slid under Alexandria's door just before dawn. It was stapled at the top left corner, unsigned and marked confidential. Internal correspondence. Its font sterile, its tone clinical, but the contents inside were anything but neutral. She read it twice in silence, her fingers tightening slightly at the corners of the page with each new paragraph. It confirmed what Raymond had suspected, what Jenna had begun to trace, and what she had feared all along. This was not just a rogue precinct or a corrupt partnership. It was an entire network of sanctioned abuse, protected at the highest levels of city leadership, and masked behind phrases like public safety integration and community stabilization initiatives. The names were all there. Wendell Meyer, the sitting chief of police, listed as a direct liaison to Greymark's expansion rollout. Karen Fielding, the deputy mayor, flagged for approving discretionary surveillance budgets through a private fund that bypassed council oversight. Alexandria sat at the kitchen table with the document in one hand and a mug of untouched coffee in the other, her thoughts moving faster than her heartbeat. She stared at the laminated surface of the table as if it could anchor her, keep her from slipping into that dangerous space between disbelief and fury. Outside, the neighborhood remained calm, unaware, the sound of sprinklers ticking softly in the distance, birds darting from branch to branch, children laughing somewhere down the street. It all felt so ordinary, so unworthy of the grief now living inside her body like a second skin. She reached for the red marker and walked over to the board on her wall, the one she and Sam had built, piece by piece, line by line, name by name. She drew two thick circles, one around Meyer, one around Fielding, then connected them with a stroke that split through three smaller names already on her list. So this is the head of the snake, she murmured to herself, stepping back, her eyes narrowing as the shape of the structure became clearer. Later that day, she met Raymond and Jenna at a neutral location, a low-rent office space used by an independent podcast team who owed Raymond a favor and didn't ask too many questions. The room smelled faintly of dust and soundproof foam, the lighting dim but functional. The kind of place that didn't look like much, but had quietly published some of the most explosive stories of the past 5 years. Jenna laid out her laptop, pulling up the visual map she'd been building, documents, financial trails, meeting logs, and back-channel emails recovered through whistleblower leaks. The digital signature from the City Hall server matches Fielding's personal device, she explained. That alone ties her directly to the contract approval pipeline. Raymond added a file folder of printed witness statements, most anonymous, some redacted, each one a nail in the coffin of plausible deniability. We're sitting on a story that could level half the city's power structure, he said quietly, not with excitement, but with the grim awareness of what came with truth this heavy. Alexandria looked at the documents in front of her, then at the faces of the two people who had stood beside her when others had fled. Then we publish it, she said. Everything. Names, dates, audio, video, no edits, no waiting for a statement. Jenna hesitated. If we do that, it won't just be a story. It'll be war. Alexandria nodded. It already is. They worked late into the night drafting timelines, cross-checking sources, uploading backups to 3 encrypted servers. When it was finished, Jenna prepared a press release with attached files set to go live across multiple platforms, news aggregators, social media, independent networks. They agreed on 6:00 a.m. sharp, a time calculated for maximum visibility and minimum interference. Once this drops, Raymond said, "We can't take it back." Alexandria didn't blink. "I'm not here to take anything back." That night, back home, Alexandria sat in Naomi's room with the laptop still open in her lap, the screen glowing softly in the dark. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just watched the cursor blink beside the final line of the letter she had written and rewritten a dozen times, the one that would go at the top of the report as her statement, as a mother, as a soldier, as a woman who had been silenced too long. The words she chose were simple. "My daughter died because powerful people thought no one would care enough to uncover the truth. They were wrong." She closed the laptop and set it gently on Naomi's desk, brushing her hand across the edge, as if touching memory itself. The house around her was quiet, still wrapped in the illusion that the world outside hadn't changed, that justice still meant something. But Alexandria no longer believed in illusions. She believed in evidence and exposure, and in the quiet roar that follows when enough people finally open their eyes. As the first light of morning bled across the sky, Alexandria stepped out onto her porch barefoot, her arms crossed over the hem of Naomi's hoodie, which she now wore like armor. The breeze was soft, the air cool against her skin, and the horizon stretched wide and open like a stage waiting for its next scene. The city would wake soon, and when it did, everything would be different. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She just watched the sky change steady, and still, like someone who had already made peace with the cost of telling the truth. They came just after midnight, when the neighborhood was asleep, and the world felt suspended between darkness and dawn. Alexandria had just closed her eyes for the first time in nearly 48 hours, her body stretched out on the couch, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. A low thud against the back window pulled her out of the edge of sleep, not loud enough to be a crash, but too sharp to be the wind. She sat up slowly, heart already beginning to race, listening carefully for the follow-up sound that always came after an accident or an intrusion. It came seconds later, the deliberate creak of wood under weight, like a porch step being tested by boots that didn't belong. She moved quietly, fluidly, just like she'd been trained to do years ago, her body remembering how to be alert without panic. She grabbed the firearm from beneath the cushion, checked the safety, and made her way toward the hallway with measured steps. Before she reached the door, her phone lit up on the counter, an alert from the exterior cameras. The footage showed 2 men in dark tactical gear circling the property, one holding what looked like a crowbar, the other scanning the side window with a flashlight clipped to his vest. She didn't recognize either of them. They moved with too much coordination to be random vandals, and too much purpose to be petty criminals. These weren't amateurs, they were professionals, calculated, quiet, efficient, and they weren't here to steal. They were here to send a message, or to erase one. Alexandria backed away from the window, breath-controlled eyes narrowing, and pressed the emergency call button. Jenna had programmed for her one touch, sent alerts to Thomas, Jenna, Raymond, and a trusted federal contact who owed her more than one favor. Within seconds the screen flashed, signal received, help en route. But seconds were all she had. A crash shattered the kitchen window glass, exploding inward like a warning shot. She ducked low behind the hallway wall, heart pounding in her throat, not from fear but from something more dangerous, resolve. 2 minutes, she whispered to herself. That's how long it'll take backup to get here. She heard footsteps inside, now heavy and confident boots scraping against broken glass, moving toward the living room. She could make out 2 distinct voices, one muttering something about data recovery, the other swearing under his breath. They weren't just here to intimidate, they were looking for something, and that something was the evidence she'd spent weeks compiling: the footage, the documents, the names, the things that were never supposed to leave City Hall or department servers. But Alexandria was always 3 steps ahead. She had already duplicated every file to 4 separate drives, stored them in different locations, one of which had already made its way into national hands. What they wanted no longer existed in this house. All that remained here was her, and she wasn't going quietly. She took position in the hallway, aimed at the entry to the living room, and called out loud and clear, "You have 30 seconds to leave before this becomes a federal crime scene." There was a pause, a beat of hesitation, and then a voice shouted back low and aggressive, "You've made too much noise already. This ends now." Alexandria didn't answer. She didn't need to. She just waited, breath slow, mind steady, arms strong. When the first man stepped into view, she fired once into the wall beside him. A warning, deliberate. The sound thundered through the house like a cannon, and in that instant, something changed. They hesitated. She could feel it. The illusion of control they carried shattered like glass underfoot. They weren't expecting resistance. They weren't expecting her to fight back. From outside came the rising sound of sirens, fast approaching, relentless. The intruders moved quickly, shouting to each other as they scrambled out the same way they came. Alexandria didn't follow. She didn't need to chase them. Their presence had confirmed everything she needed to know. The story was no longer just dangerous. It was personal. The police arrived minutes later, late enough to miss the action, but early enough to pretend they'd been part of the solution. Flashlights swept the rooms, radios, crackled questions were asked, and half answered, and statements were scribbled with the kind of care that never reached a courtroom. One of the officers tried to comfort her with practiced sympathy, offering a blanket she didn't need and words she didn't believe. But she was calm, too calm. She walked the perimeter with one of the junior officers pointing out the broken glass, the boot prints in the grass, the tire tracks in the alley. "They weren't here to rob me," she said flatly. "They were here to erase something." The officer said nothing, only nodded as if he understood more than he was allowed to say. By the time everyone left, it was almost sunrise again. Alexandria stood on her porch shoulders, square eyes fixed on the edge of the street where the shadows met the light. She knew the attack wouldn't be the last. She knew the people behind it weren't finished. But neither was she. She returned inside, swept the glass into a metal bin, locked the windows, checked the cameras again. Everything was routine now. Everything had purpose. She wasn't shaken. She wasn't broken. She was prepared. And when she sat back at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where the bullet had buried itself into the drywall just inches from her family portrait, she didn't feel fear. She felt confirmation. The morning after the break-in, Alexandria stood by her living room window, watching sunlight push through the oak trees, as if the night hadn't happened. The floor beneath her bare feet was cold, the faint scent of gunpowder still lingering in the air, a silent reminder of how close things had come to collapsing. The bullet hole in the drywall was now patched, but not painted, left exposed, like a scar she wasn't ready to cover. She sipped her coffee slowly, the mug warm against her palms, her thoughts clear, deliberate, measured, not because she was calm, but because she had no time left to waste on fear. She spent the morning revisiting everything: timelines, witness statements, chain of command structures, and every document Jenna had secured over the past 2 weeks. Her notebook was thick with scribbled annotations, arrows, connecting names and funding trails, highlighter marks framing key dates like neon flags on a battlefield. She worked without music, without distraction, her fingers tapping softly against the table with each realization that clicked into place. There were no longer questions about if this was orchestrated, only how deep it went and how much the public still didn't know. By noon she had made her decision. It was time to go public fully, relentlessly, without filter or apology. She met Jenna and Raymond in the back room of a community center that doubled as a legal aid clinic and a safe zone for whistleblowers. The room was spare but solid, with thick concrete walls and no windows, the kind of place where secrets could breathe without being heard. Jenna had already laid out the game plan: 8 encrypted hard drives, 3 off-site data caches, and a master video file stitched together from every thread they had gathered. Body cam fragments, leaked emails, city budgets, and interviews from officers who had stayed silent for years but were now ready to speak. "We hit publish tomorrow," Jenna said, her voice calm but hoarse from days of non-stop work. "We sync across 7 platforms at once, release the documents, then live stream the evidence with your statement." Raymond glanced up from his notes, his tone steady. "You sure you're ready to be the face of this?" Alexandria didn't blink. "I was ready the moment they lied about my daughter," she said. "The moment they tried to erase her like she never mattered." They rehearsed the release twice, once for flow, once for backup contingency. Jenna walked through emergency signal triggers, just in case the stream was hacked or blocked, while Raymond prepped a second wave of journalists to follow up with coverage if the original platforms were taken down. Every step was precise, intentional, built from experience and the bitter knowledge that truth didn't always survive on its own. When they finished, Alexandria sat alone for a while in the dim room, breathing in the stillness, letting her body adjust to what was coming. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about exposure, about removing the mask that corruption wears and showing people what it truly looks like underneath. Naomi had trusted the world to be fair. Alexandria had spent her whole life learning it wasn't. Now maybe, just maybe, the gap between those two beliefs could be bridged by truth. She went home that evening and sat on the back porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and soft crimson. The wind moved through the trees like a quiet voice brushing her skin and lifting a single photo that had been pinned beneath a stone on the table, a picture of Naomi from her 16th birthday, laughing, head tilted back, eyes full of plans. Alexandria caught it before it flew away, her fingers closing gently around the edge like she was holding the last piece of a memory she couldn't afford to lose. She didn't cry, not because she was numb, but because she was full of her daughter's voice, full of the stories that needed to be told, full of the names of the mothers who had buried children and never been heard. She looked out across the yard, quiet and still, then whispered into the wind, "Tomorrow, baby girl, tomorrow they'll hear you." And for the first time in weeks, she felt something return, not peace, not relief, but purpose, so clear it made her spine straighten and her breath deepen. Not because she was fearless, but because she was finally stepping into the place Naomi had always believed she belonged. Not just a mother, not just a soldier, but a reckoning. The meeting was set for 6:30 p.m. in the back room of a quiet Ethiopian restaurant tucked between a laundromat and an auto shop. One of those places where the lighting was soft, the service discreet, and the sound of sizzling lentils covered the tension of conversation. Raymond had arranged it through a burner phone using coded language, like it was muscle memory, and the man they were supposed to meet was a junior officer, someone still on the force, someone with enough access to hurt the system if he chose. To tell the truth, Alexandria arrived first, wearing jeans, a dark sweater, and a jacket that didn't draw attention, just another tired woman grabbing takeout after a long day, nothing more. She sat facing the door, her back to the wall, eyes sharp but unreadable, her hands wrapped around a glass of water she hadn't touched. Raymond walked in a few minutes later, nodded once without speaking, and slid into the booth across from her. "He's running late," he said quietly, already scanning the room. "Nervous. Said he needed to be sure we were alone." Alexandria didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her gaze had already swept the perimeter, 3 occupied tables, 1 waiter, 1 cook visible through the kitchen window. No cameras, no signs of outside interference. But even before the trap snapped shut, something in her gut felt wrong. Not loud, not urgent, just off. Raymond reached into his coat for the flash drive they were supposed to give the officer, but before he could slide it across the table, a sudden crash shattered the rhythm of the room. The front window exploded inward as 2 masked figures kicked it open, guns drawn, moving with practiced speed and deadly intention. The restaurant erupted in screams, chairs clattering, plates crashing to the floor. Alexandria was already in motion, grabbing Raymond by the collar and yanking him down just as a bullet tore through the wall where his head had been. Out the back, she shouted, dragging him toward the kitchen, heart-hammering eyes darting between shadows and light. The cook shouted something in Amharic and dropped to the floor as Alexandria shoved open the back door, her boots slipping slightly on the grease-slicked tiles. She didn't look back. There was no time. In that moment, there was only the alley, only the cold air, only the narrow escape route she'd clocked the moment she walked in. She could hear footsteps behind them, 2 men, maybe 3, moving fast, not yelling, just breathing hard, the way trained operators do when they know their window is closing. Raymond stumbled once but caught himself, his hand clutching the flash drive like it was a detonator. "They knew," he gasped, voice ragged. "This was supposed to be safe." Alexandria didn't answer. Her mind was already calculating distance to the car line of sight where the backup weapon was tucked into her boot. They reached the corner of the alley just as a black SUV screeched into view, cutting them off with brutal precision. She grabbed Raymond and pivoted, heading in the opposite direction, but it was too late. The second team was already waiting, 3 men in unmarked gear, their faces hidden behind balaclavas, their weapons raised in silence. "Drop it," one of them shouted, eyes locked on Raymond's hand, and in that split second she saw it. The moment everything bent toward violence. Raymond turned his head slightly, looked at her, and did something she didn't expect. He ran. He sprinted toward the far wall, away from her, away from them, drawing the men with him, shouting, "Get it out, Alex, run!" Alexandria froze for half a second, her instincts at war with her, training her breath catching as the sound of gunfire cracked through the alley like fireworks too close to the skin. Raymond went down hard face first, the flash drive still clenched in his hand. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She didn't even blink. She just turned and ran fast and low, cutting through side streets, her mind screaming, "Don't stop, don't look back, just move." By the time she reached her car, her lungs burned and her eyes were full of salt. She didn't cry. Not yet. She didn't even curse. She just started the engine, peeled out of the lot, and didn't stop until she was 20 miles outside the city, pulled off on a rural back road, surrounded by nothing but silence and pine trees. Only then did she open her palm and realize Raymond had slipped the flash drive into her jacket pocket during the chaos. She gripped it tightly, knuckles white, her entire body trembling from the aftermath, not just of the ambush but of his choice. He had known what would happen. He had seen it coming, and still he ran toward the fire. Still he chose to draw it away from her. Still he chose to give her time to carry the truth forward, even if it cost him everything. For several minutes Alexandria sat alone in the car, the engine off her hands, shaking slightly as she stared at the trees ahead. The world outside was quiet again, but it didn't feel calm. It felt suspended, like something sacred had been broken just beneath the surface. She thought of Naomi. She thought of the photo in her wallet. She thought of the way Raymond had smiled earlier that day when they finalized the press release and said, "We're almost there." And now he was gone. And she wasn't. The wind moved through the trees, slow and low like the breath of something ancient and tired. Alexandria leaned her head back against the seat, eyes closed, the flash drive still clenched in her hand. She could still feel his voice in her memory. "Run, Alex, get it out." She wasn't just running anymore. She was delivering. And the truth he died to protect would be louder now than anything they could silence. The air was colder than it should have been for spring, with clouds hanging low over the rooftops and the wind shifting like it knew something was coming. Alexandria pulled her coat tighter as she stepped out of the safe house, her boots crunching softly against gravel, her eyes scanning the horizon like they used to in combat zones, calm, alert, without fear, but never without consequence. She hadn't slept since Raymond died. Sleep had become something distant and unfamiliar, something for people not carrying the weight of the truth inside a flash drive tucked into the lining of their coat. There were no more what-ifs now, no more waiting to be ready, no more worrying about timing, optics, or backlash. The plan was simple. It had to be. Upload the footage, release the documents, push the truth into the daylight before anyone else had the chance to bury it again. The team was already in motion, Jenna coordinating from a bunker 2 counties away, Sam mobilizing retired vets to monitor any interference, and the journalists Raymond had trusted working overtime to prep the publication in multiple languages and formats. But Alexandria's task was something else, something older, something final. She was going to deliver the truth in person. She'd chosen the courthouse steps not because they were dramatic, but because they were visible. Because justice, even when broken, still held symbolic ground. Because the very people who'd lied, covered up, erased her daughter's life in silence would now hear Naomi's voice echoed from the heart of the system they tried to weaponize. The press conference wasn't official. There were no permits, no approval. It was grassroots, unfiltered, direct. And in that rawness lay its power. As she approached the downtown square, the city looked the same on the surface. Commuters rushing past with coffee in hand, street musicians strumming soft chords, banners advertising spring festivals. But beneath it, a current had shifted. People knew. Whispers had turned into murmurs, murmurs into posts, posts into questions. And questions, if asked loud enough, had a tendency to bring everything to a halt. Alexandria moved through the plaza like she belonged to it, passing a group of young women holding signs with Naomi's face printed in black and white. The words, "Her name was Naomi," stenciled beneath. They didn't know she was there yet, not until she stepped onto the courthouse step. The cameras turned toward her like sunflowers to light reporters, shifting forward with mics raised civilians, pulling out phones unsure at first who she was, until the screen behind her lit up and Naomi's voice filled the plaza with calm, intelligent defiance. The recording was from a school debate, one Alexandria had watched 100 times, where Naomi argued that systems built to harm could be dismantled only by truth too loud to ignore. As the words played, Alexandria stood in silence, her posture straight, her hands steady at her sides. Then she began to speak, Not with theatrics or rehearsed lines, but with the quiet force of someone who had lived the weight of every word. She told them what happened. Not just to Naomi, but to the dozens of names buried in redacted files, the communities manipulated by surveillance networks, the officers incentivized to turn neighborhoods into war zones under the banner of safety. She named names, showed documents, played clips. One by one, she pulled their secrets into the daylight like weeds torn from stone. Some of the crowd wept, some stood frozen. Others raised fists, but no one looked away. And when it was over, when the footage ended and her voice finally rested, she said just one thing more. You don't get to erase her. You don't get to define her in the aftermath of your violence. She was more than a moment. She was 17 years of brilliance, love, and belief in a world you didn't deserve to govern. And I promise you this, Naomi didn't die for a hashtag. She died because you were afraid of what her life represented. That ends today. The applause didn't come all at once. It came slowly, then all at once, like thunder from too many hearts beating at once. Alexandria didn't raise her arms or soak in the noise. She stepped down from the platform with the same steady gait she'd walked in with. Sam was waiting near the side of the plaza, his arms crossed, eyes glinting with something between pride and sorrow. He handed her a bottle of water. It's done, he said softly. They can't put it back in the dark now. She nodded once. It was never about me. It's about what they did, and what they thought no one would ever prove. Back at her car, she paused before unlocking the door, glancing across the square now filled with movement chants, cameras, and rising chants of justice for Naomi. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. Not because the pain was gone, it wasn't, it never would be, but because the silence was gone, and that in its own way was a beginning. She slid into the driver's seat, placed both hands on the wheel, and looked up at the rearview mirror. For a long moment she stared into her own reflection, not searching for strength but recognizing it. And behind her eyes there was a memory clear and unwavering, Naomi's laugh, full and real, bouncing through the house, on a Saturday morning, unburdened and loud. She turned the ignition, and as the engine hummed quietly beneath her, Alexandria whispered, "You're still speaking, baby girl. And this time the world is finally listening." The cemetery was quiet that morning, wrapped in the kind of fog that makes the world feel paused, like time is waiting for you to catch your breath before it moves forward again. The trees around the perimeter stood tall and still, their branches barely swaying, as if they too understood this moment belonged to something sacred. Alexandria moved slowly between the rows of stone markers, the dew soaking through the hem of her slacks, her footsteps silent but steady as she approached the grave she'd visited so many times in the past few weeks. She held no flowers, no candles, no words rehearsed in her head, only presence. Naomi's headstone was simple, just the way her daughter would have wanted it, smooth, granite, her name carved with care, and beneath it a line Alexandria had chosen, not for sorrow, but for truth. She spoke, and the world answered. It had taken her days to decide on those 7 words, not because she didn't know what Naomi meant to the world, but because she didn't know how to capture the way her daughter still echoed in every breath she took. She stood in silence for a while, hands tucked into her coat pockets, eyes fixed, not on the name, but on the empty space, just beneath it, the space where everything had changed. Behind her in the distance, the wind stirred the flags near the veterans section of the cemetery, their soft flapping a steady rhythm that reminded her of the base camps she used to walk at sunrise, where grief was buried beneath layers of duty and tears came only when no one was looking. She blinked slowly, breathed in the cold air, and finally let herself speak. "It's done, baby," she said gently. "They saw you. They heard you. And they'll never forget your name again." She sat down, then, not caring that the ground was wet, her knees sinking into the soft earth, her hands resting in her lap as if holding something unseen. Her body still carried tension in places she couldn't reach, her shoulders high. Her jaw clenched, a tremor lingering in her fingers. But inside there was a shift, a space opening where the weight had once pressed against her ribs with every breath. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't bracing for the next blow. She wasn't preparing for another headline, another threat, another press call. She was simply here. And here Naomi was with her. Not in the ground, not in the stone, but in the quiet strength she felt returning to her chest, like the slow, sure rhythm of something healing. The fight had cost her more than she knew how to name. It had taken friends' sleep, the illusion of safety, and a future that once felt predictable. But it had given her something else in return: clarity. A vision of justice not as a finish line but as a responsibility carried day after day even when no one is watching. Especially then. She thought about Raymond. About the way he'd looked at her in that final moment before he ran toward danger, trusting her to finish what they started. She thought about Jenna still at her post, tirelessly defending the truth from the shadows of suppression. She thought about Sam, quiet but unwavering, holding the line beside her without ever asking for thanks. And then, of course, she thought of Naomi, the girl who had once told her with all the confidence in the world, "If I see something broken, I have to say something. Otherwise, I'm part of the silence." The silence was broken now, and in its place, there was a sound more powerful than any bullet or lie, the collective voice of those who had been unheard for too long, finally rising, finally being named. Alexandria stood slowly, her hands brushing against her knees, her back straightening, not out of habit but because it felt right. She looked down at the headstone one last time, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out Naomi's bracelet, the one with the faded engraving, the words nearly worn smooth from years of wear. "Always forward." She knelt again and gently placed it at the base of the marker, a final gift from mother to daughter, from the woman who had survived to the girl who had led. The sky had begun to brighten now, the fog lifting in soft tendrils, revealing more of the path behind her and more of the world ahead. As she walked back to her car, she didn't rush. She didn't check her phone or scan the street. She let the air fill her lungs fully for the first time in weeks. And as she opened the car door and sat behind the wheel, her eyes caught the edge of the mirror where her own reflection looked back, not tired, not broken, but present. There was still more work ahead, always would be. But today, in this small, quiet moment, Alexandria Cole allowed herself something sacred: stillness. And in that stillness the voice of her daughter remained. Not fading, but carried. In life there are losses that nothing can truly replace, but it's how we choose to face the truth and stand up that defines who we are. Alexandria's story isn't just about the pain of losing a child, it's the journey of a mother who refused to let her daughter be forgotten in silence. She turned her grief into action and injustice into a reason for all of us to pause and ask ourselves, are we staying silent in the face of what's wrong, or do we have the courage to speak up? For those in the later chapters of life, the lesson runs even deeper. Life doesn't end at loss. It can begin again through will, through resilience, and through truth spoken at the right moment. Even if we're no longer young, our voices still carry weight. Sometimes it's those who have lived, endured, and overcome who hold the power to make the world listen. And if you're holding something in your heart that's yet to be said, know this: it's never too late to speak up for what's right. If this story touched your heart, please give the video a like so more people can hear this message. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay connected with more emotional, powerful, and meaningful stories. Every like, every subscription from you gives us the strength to keep sharing truth and hope. Thank you for listening.